I have a strong interest in this question of Holocaust remembrance and was asked by Matthew and by Andrew to talk about that today, and in particular with a connection to Australia. Because we might well ask the question, why here in Australia would we give so much attention to the Holocaust, an event which happened quite some time ago and on the other side of the world? Why is remembrance so important to us here? And I must say, even for some survivors, the reason why they came to Australia after the Holocaust was because it was so far away, because they wanted to put that distance between them and the horrors that they had lived through. So why is it that it's important to us? Of course it's important to Jewish people in Australia, and there is a long history of a Jewish presence in this country. It goes back to the First Fleet, where I understand there were something like a dozen Jews among those first Europeans to arrive in Australia. And of course, those people who arrived then and through the decades that followed took a close interest in what was happening on the other side of the world, what was happening to Jews in Europe. And even in the 19th century, there was good reason for them to be concerned, if not alarmed, about certain things that happened. Those who might have had some connection to Eastern Europe, to Tsarist Russia, were very concerned about news of pogroms, acts of violence against Jews that happened there in the latter part of the 19th century and the early 20th century. But it wasn't just in Eastern Europe that there were these sorts of examples of anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews. In France as well, we think above all of the so-called Dreyfus affair, the locking away of a Jewish army officer on trumped-up charges, the great example perhaps of anti-Semitism in Europe around the turn of the century. But then, of course, those concerns only grew in the 1930s after Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany. And it was known, of course, that Hitler was very much an anti-Semite. And for that reason, Australians took a keen interest in what was happening on the other side of the world. They took an even keener interest when it became clear that things were so desperate there that there were many Jews who wanted to come all the way to the Antipodes to find a haven for them. And so it was that in that period, the late 1930s, even to 1940, there were about 8,000 Jewish refugees who came to Australia. And in particular, after Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, or as many insist, the November pogrom, because that's what it was, a pogrom, there were very many who wanted to leave Europe to find safety in Australia. It has to be said, not everyone in Australia was welcoming of this idea that refugees should come here. On both sides of politics in Australia, there were those who had their reservations and put them very forthrightly. On the Labor side of politics, people said, we're still coming out of the Depression. If these people come to Australia, they'll take our jobs. On the other side of politics as well, there were those who said that this was a problem which didn't concern Australia. In the middle of 1938, there was an international conference held to discuss the refugee issue. It was held in Evian in France, and Australia sent a representative, a member of the government, a certain Thomas White, who said words to the effect that Australia did not have a racial problem and it did not want to import one, so Australia shouldn't be asked to increase its quota of refugees. But then there were those who were more welcoming. And one of those I wanted to mention briefly is someone Andrew already mentioned, so he's stolen a part of my thunder. This is William Cooper, and I noticed that he is mentioned in this wonderful exhibition as well. An Indigenous man from northern Victoria, from the Yorta Yorta people. He learned of the November pogrom, and he did something to respond. He had founded the Australian Aborigines League. As an Indigenous man, he was not a citizen of this country, and yet, having learned about the November pogrom, he decided that something had to be done. So he collected a petition and he took the names on that petition to the German consulate in Melbourne. It was a magnificent gesture of protest. The other example I wanted to point to was the example of the Dunera, because what happened then was that refugees did come to Australia. There was a quota of 5,000 a year. It wasn't filled because after the war broke out in 1939, it was very difficult to leave Europe. But there is this example of the Dunera, a former troop ship, which brought something like 2,000 Jewish refugees to Australia, not arriving here until 1940. These were mainly young Jewish men from Austria and Germany who had been living at the time of the outbreak of the war in Britain, where they were classified as enemy aliens. And they were put onto this troop ship, the Dunera, in very overcrowded conditions, alongside also some Germans who were in fact quite sympathetic to the Nazis, but the authorities tended not to make that distinction among their so-called enemy aliens. And so it was that in, at times, quite appalling circumstances, the so-called Dunera boys made their way to Australia on the Dunera and were taken to internment camps. After they were released, they served Australia well. Many of them joined the Australian Armed Forces in employment battalions and did their bit for the war effort because they saw themselves as making some kind of contribution to their adopted homeland in this way. And at the end of the war, about half of them chose to remain in Australia, where they made magnificent contributions in all walks of life, whether as artists or musicians or engineers or architects. One of them was this man. His name is Ludwig Hirschfeld Mack, and he was from Frankfurt, born in 1893. And like lots of German Jews, he served in the First World War and won the Iron Cross. He was a patriotic German. But in the 1930s, he knew that Germany offered no future for him because of his Jewish background. So he was one of those who went to England. Having arrived in Australia as one of the Dunera boys, he too was taken to an internment camp. But when released, ultimately he returned to his original noble profession and became a teacher in Geelong in Victoria, while continuing also to be an artist. And one of his artworks is this one. It's a woodcut, which I thought was quite a nice way to demonstrate my connections today between Australia and Europe. It's called Desolation, and you might think when you first look at it that this must surely be about Europe. Here's a man standing in front of a barbed wire fence. Perhaps this is a concentration camp in Hitler's Germany. But then you see there's a Southern Cross in the sky above. This is a view which is based on his own experience in an internment camp in Australia. Now, after the war, there were many more Jews who came to Australia, came as refugees, as Holocaust survivors. Larger numbers than had managed to come here before the war. One of them is here today in Regina Zielinski. And it's a fact that per head of population, Australia took more Holocaust survivors than any other country in the world, with the exception of Israel. So, of course, these people too had an interest in learning about what was going on in Europe, in discovering the truth about the Holocaust. And yet, and perhaps there's something of an irony here, a lot of these people at first, for a couple of decades after the war, tended not to focus on the Holocaust. They wanted to get on with their lives, establish new lives on the other side of the world. But then, as the years passed, many of them retired, and once more they focused on that piece of history that was also a part of their personal history. And their children wanted to know what they'd been through, and their grandchildren ultimately wanted to know what they'd gone through. And so we see in Australia, but in other parts of the world as well, a great interest in Holocaust history, especially through the 70s, the 80s, through to the present day, an interest which manifests itself in lots of ways. If you look at the United States, for example, there's the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. If you look at Germany, for example, there's now a Holocaust memorial in the heart of Berlin, the outcome of many years of debate. And then in Australia, we had and still have a Holocaust Museum and Research Centre in Melbourne, and the Sydney Jewish Museum, which devotes a good deal of its attention to the history of the Holocaust. All of these are signs of this renewed interest in history in Australia and in other parts of the world. So we might say in conclusion that Australia is indeed far removed from Europe, far removed in space, but now also in time, from where the Holocaust happened. But the connections are still very strong through those survivors, through the families of those survivors. But I want to argue also that there's a stronger connection, that the Holocaust is a part of everyone's history. Because as we talk about it, as we look at this exhibition, we can see lots of ways in which it connects with our lives. It raises questions like, how do we deal with racism? How do we deal with refugees? How do we resolve issues among ourselves without resorting to violence? What makes some people behave badly? Or in so many instances here, what makes people behave well, admirably? So it's not just a piece of Jewish history or European history. As William Cooper realised, it's relevant for all of us in any age and in any part of the world. Now, of course, to keep the memory alive, we need tangible ways of helping us. You know that yourselves if you try to think back to your childhood. It's often helpful to have something like a photo to remember those early days by. Well, it's the same with Holocaust remembrance. Without some kind of props to help you remember, it's very difficult to achieve that goal. So I'm very pleased that Andrew in particular and others have gone to this trouble to put together this fantastic exhibition. I hope it triggers learning and teaching here. I hope that it helps you think historically about the Holocaust, but also I hope it helps you think about issues not just relating to the past, but to the present. And I hope that perhaps I'll see some of you at Flinders in a few years' time. Thanks for listening to me.